It's great to have you back, and welcome to lecture cycle 8, in which we learn about species and speciation. So this marks kind of a turning point in the class. In this lecture cycle and the next, we are switching from what you could think of as the study of microevolution, so changes in allele frequencies within a population, and we're making the turn now to what we can call macroevolution. Evolution, but on a bigger scale. It often encompasses bigger scales of time, so maybe millions or even billions of years, instead of just a number of generations. And also, the scale is larger sort of taxonomically. Just a couple points before we get into today's lecture. First of all, a reminder that you do have an OWL quiz this weekend coming up, so that'll open up in a few days. The weird thing about this upcoming OWL quiz, the thing that is unusual, is that it will include content from lecture cycle 7, so all about sex, as well as from cycle 8. So you might want to review your notes from cycle 7 before you open up the quiz. The other thing that I really want to stress, and maybe you've seen it if you've looked at the learning outcomes, is in today's lecture, I will be going very fast, throwing out a number of different species names and dates, and people often get all bent out of shape and think that it's important for them to memorize the information, the dates, when was our most recent common ancestor with gorillas, when did our most recent common ancestor with sharks live. No, that stuff is not testable. The important part of today's lecture is just to prime yourself for thinking in terms of evolutionary trees and how we read them and what they mean. So I'll start really broad. We are not alone on the planet. There's millions of other species that share the planet with us. And even though you've probably heard that we are in the midst of a biodiversity crisis, we are probably embarking on a 6th mass extinction event, even though you've probably heard that of all the species alive on the planet today, maybe as many as 50% of them will have gone extinct by the year 2100. This is true. So extinctions are very rapidly accelerating. However, at the same time, our ability to discover and describe new species in a scientific way is stronger now than it ever has been. So even though existing species are very rapidly going extinct, every year we discover many, many new species. And there were something like 18,000 species described just in the last 12 months. So new species are discovered every year. And so every year when I give this lecture, I like to just start off with a little highlights reel. Of the 18,000 new species that we know about now that we didn't know about this time last year, I'm not going to go over all of them, but just a few highlights. One of the ways that we can discover new species is to go exploring, maybe to new habitats, parts of the world that humans have not been able to visit before, or at least that scientists and biologists have not visited before. And so there was a really productive expedition in the last year to northwest Peru where they discovered dozens and dozens and dozens of species that had never been described before, including a new species of bat, a weird little semi-aquatic mouse that is really great at swimming, this fish with a blob on its head. We don't know what it does with the blob, but they think it helps it hunt. Maybe it echolocates like a dolphin, and this arboreal salamander. So one way that you might discover a new species is just go out into the jungle where scientists have not been before, and you may discover species that we didn't previously know about. Or if you're really brave, maybe you go and go cave diving. And so here's another new species that was discovered just very, very recently in the last year. This is a completely blind cave fish. It lives in pools of water that are in caves below the surface of the earth, off the coast of one of the Indonesian islands. So another way that you could discover a new species. Sometimes the new species that we discover are not so much discovered, but recognized to all of a sudden we recognize that they are a distinct species, and we might use DNA analysis or other molecular techniques to do that. And so here's like I use the scare quotes, a new species of manta ray called the Atlantic manta ray that lives off the coast of Mexico, and these things are pretty dope, and they're giant. They're like 5 or 6 meters across. Now, we knew already that there were manta rays living in that part of the ocean. That's not surprising. What the discovery was that allowed us to name this new species was to compare the genetics, the DNA sequence similarity between this population of manta ray and the original species, the giant oceanic manta ray. And it was discovered using genetic information that, oh no, these things are different enough that we should call them their own species. More in the next lecture about how different you have to be considered a new species. Another way, so biologists are not the only people who are discovering new species. Paleontologists, people that study the fossil record, people that study extinct organisms can also discover new species, in this case, that have already gone extinct. So here's a proposed new species of hominid, so belonging to the same genus that we are in, but probably a different species. The proposed name is Homo juluensis, for big-headed guy, because of the very large cranial capacity, larger than in modern humans. And it seems to have lived in Eastern Asia, and between like 300,000 and 40,000 years ago. So roughly around the same time as Neanderthals, and then later went extinct for whatever reason. So here's an example of what seems to be its own species. It's still kind of controversial, but by the time we discovered it, it's been extinct for thousands and thousands of years. And similarly, new species of dinosaur are often being unearthed in the fossil record. Here's one that I just included. It was discovered in the last year in Colorado, and it's called Enigma cursor, so puzzle runner or puzzling runner, because it's got these fast little legs. And this was probably about the size of like a Labrador retriever dog, if any of you have labs. And would have been a herbivore. So there's a reconstruction of it. Actually, this isn't Enigma cursor. This is like some predator that's trying to eat Enigma cursor, and Enigma cursor are these little guys scattering here. The point being that every year we discover things like these and thousands of other examples of new species. So the fact that we are continually discovering so many new species that we didn't know about suggests that there remains many, many more species out there that are completely unknown to science. And so we could ask, how many species are there in the world? That turns out to be a hard question. We know how many species, well, obviously we know how many species we have names for because we could just count them. For prokaryotic organisms, for bacteria and archaea, for things without a nucleus, it's sort of quite difficult to tell where one species ends and another begins. But even if we just consider eukaryotes, things with a nucleus, there's approximately 1.2 million species of eukaryotes out there that we know about, that have names. Okay, so we know about 1.2 million species. There's probably more. There's got to be more because we keep discovering new ones. But how many? Have we discovered like about half of the biodiversity on Earth, or 10%, or 90%? And this question has been addressed using mathematical modeling. And so researchers have looked at changes in how many, in the rate at which we are discovering new species, both on land and in the ocean. Does it seem to be sort of leveling off, or are we is our ability to find new species still accelerating? And they sort of controlled for like search effort. Are we looking harder to find new species on land? Are we looking harder to find new species in the ocean? And they have estimated that based on the rate at which we are discovering new species and how hard we are attempting to find those new species, the actual number of species, at least species of eukaryote, is probably around 8.7 million. There's huge error bars around that. But this would suggest that we've only described about 10%, maybe a little more than 10% of the biodiversity out there. The other 90% remains completely unknown to science yet, so far. 8.7 million species is a lot. Some scientists have criticized this paper fairly harshly and said, no, 8.7 million is probably a real lowball estimate. It's probably closer to 100 million species. Again, a lot of uncertainty, we don't know, but there's almost certainly many more species that we don't know about than species that we do know about. Okay. So I want to go on and just sort of revisit origin of species and Darwin's theory in general. And as you know, when a lot of people think about origin of species or Darwin's idea of descent from a common ancestor by natural selection, Darwin's name now is kind of synonymous with natural selection. We think of that as his genius idea that set him apart from everyone else. But what was really radical at the time, of course, and got people really talking and excited or angry about his theory was more the idea of common descent, the idea that everything on Earth was related to everything else, and specifically the idea that this included humans, that humans were not the product of a special creation, but we were just related to everything else. And this is this is the first depiction of what we can call a phylogenetic tree, or this sort of depiction of how different living things are related to each other. In a more formal depiction now, this is called a whole life phylogeny. And you've probably seen diagrams like this, and you can see that animals are just this little branch here on this whole life phylogeny, and we as humans, one of the thousands and thousands of species of animals would just be like a tiny little twig or a little hair coming off this here. The important thing is that for every combination of species, whether humans and oak trees, or salmonella bacteria and your dog, or ciliates and slime molds, there is some most recent common ancestor. Everything is related to everything else. And so if you go back far enough in time, you would arrive at the point where the common ancestor, say, of animals and plants would have lived. So there would have been some organism here. Some of its descendants evolved into all the modern day plants, and some of its descendants evolved into all the modern day animals. And we call that sort of joining point the most recent common ancestor for those organisms that we're looking at. And at some point, back at this very base of the tree of life, there is what we call the last universal common ancestor. So at some point, very far back in evolutionary time, there would have been an organism that gave rise, whose descendants include everything that is now alive on the planet today. So it was an ancestor of all the bacteria. It was an ancestor. Some of its descendants went on to become what we call the archaea, another type of prokaryote. Some of its descendants went on to become the eukaryotes, including animals and humans. That is the last universal common ancestor. So what do we mean when we talk about, and I'm going to call it LUCA, just for short, just because that's easier to say. So LUCA is not the first living thing. Okay, life had formed already way, not even shown on this slide. Luca was not the first living thing. Luca was also almost certainly not alone in the world. So at the time that Luca existed, there would have been other individuals, maybe other different types of species as well, probably all unicellular. But Luca was not the first living thing, so Luca had ancestors. Probably didn't reproduce sexually, so it probably didn't have two parents, but it would have had one parent. We can call it its mother. So Luca had a mother, Luca had a grandmother and a great-grandmother. Those things are all universal common ancestors, but they're not the last universal common ancestor. Luca lived more recently than they did. Luca lived later than they did. That's what makes Luca the last universal common ancestor. Okay. It's going to get a little weird here now, but that's okay. But basically what we're going to do is travel all the way down from modern day humans all the way down to Luca. So what you may not know about me is that before I was a biology major as an undergrad, I was an English major. And one of the things that my university made English majors do, their equivalent of like a weeding out process, was to make them read the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. And has anyone read the Canterbury Tales? Okay, I don't remember it too well, but what I remember is that it is a story about, it's written in Middle English, it's very difficult to read, but it's about a bunch of religious pilgrims, individuals that are trying to get to the cathedral at Canterbury. And they're all starting from different places in England, but they're all going to the same place. So they are moving in space. They've all got different starting points, but the same ultimate destination. And so because of that, they begin to meet up with each other on the road until finally they all meet up at Canterbury. That is the Canterbury Tales. And every time they meet each other, then the new person that's just shown up tells them a story or a little morality anecdote or sings them a song or tells them a joke, and they laugh and think about the things that they have in common and how they're different. Now, this narrative structure was sort of co-opted by somebody who is a biologist, Richard Dawkins, in his book, The Ancestor's Tale. And has anyone read The Ancestor's Tale? It's really long. It's actually really great. I would rather have you read The Ancestor's Tale than the Canterbury Tales. But The Ancestor's Tale sort of takes this structure, but instead of a number of humans starting from different places and all going to the same place, The Ancestor's Tale has millions and millions and millions of different species starting at the present day and all moving back in time until they come to the last universal common ancestor. And so because we're humans reading the book, the audience of the book is all humans. We start with humans, and then humans go back in time until they meet their until they meet their closest evolutionary relatives. And we think about how long does that take? When was it that we last branched off from our closest evolutionary relatives? And we're going to be doing, basically, following the structure of that book for the rest of today's lecture. Think of it as traveling backwards in time for about 3.2 billion years. We're going to start at modern day, start from the perspective of humans, because we're all humans, and we're just going to climb down the tree of life. We start at the tips of that tree. Here's the modern day, and here's all the millions of species that share the planet with us, and we're going to go back in time. So humans are doing that, but also slime molds are doing that, and oak trees are doing that, and banana plants are doing it all at the same time. And we meet up with each other at these branching points on the tree of life. So, okay, yeah. So these branching points here. Here's where, if animals are going down this way and fungi are going down this way, they meet up with each other here. Now, technically, time flows forward. So really, these branching points are speciation events. We've got one lineage giving rise to 2 different lineages. We'll talk more about speciation in the next lecture. But the way that we will experience it in today's lecture are not divergence, but convergence, joining points. So we call them rendezvous points, but really they're speciation events. And at each of these rendezvous points, which are really speciation events, we're going to meet up with our evolutionary cousins and maybe speculate a bit about the nature of the most recent common ancestor that we share with those cousins. Okay, just a quick little digression. So hopefully people had a chance to review the little video about how everyone is related to everyone else. And that introduced the idea of pedigree collapse. And so if I were to ask you, how many ancestors do you have you had ever? How many ancestors did you have 10 generations ago? How many ancestors did you have 20 generations ago? It seems like it should be fairly easy to answer because you have 2 parents and then 4 grandparents. They each had 2 parents. And so it seems as though you should be able to just keep doubling every generation. The problem is, if you saw the video, that once you get to like 30 or 35 generations back, you all of a sudden have these unwieldy, very unwieldy numbers that are much larger, 34 billion ancestors. There have never been 34 billion humans alive on the planet. Our population size has never been that high. So what gives? Why doesn't our number of unique individual ancestors keep on doubling every generation back we go? And the answer, as you probably know if you saw the video, is this idea of pedigree collapse. So not all of those ancestors are actually unique individuals. Some of them are doing double duty. So maybe like your great-great-great-great-grandfather on your dad's side was also an ancestor on your mother's side. In other words, maybe your parents were, I'm not saying any of your parents were like super close cousins, but maybe they were like 5th cousins or 6th cousins or something. And so they did actually have some ancestors in common. That is how we can reconcile why our number of ancestors doesn't keep on doubling and fanning out indefinitely into the past. This is called pedigree collapse. Okay, and so again, it just reinforces the idea that everyone is related to everyone else. And if we go back far enough in time, if I had access to everybody's family tree in this room, we could go back a certain number of generations and find an individual that is an ancestor of mine, but also an ancestor of yours, and also an ancestor of yours and of everybody in this room. The question is, how far back would we have to do that? And how far back in time would we have to go to do that for every person in the whole world? So for all humans in the world, when was it that our most recent common ancestor probably lived? We can call that rendezvous 0. Before we even think about meeting up with other species that are our close relatives, how closely related are all the humans on Earth to each other? How far back in time would we have to go to find an individual who is a direct ancestor of everybody alive today? So just one clicker question for this lecture. Just take an informed guess. And it's also fun to think about how you would even figure this out. Like, do you need to have everybody's, the pedigree for every single human, all 8 or 9 billion humans alive in the world today? Or is there some way that we can sort of estimate this mathematically? And that, of course, is how we have attempted to answer it, is by making certain mathematical assumptions. Okay, so let's take a look at, all right, two most popular answers are A, and C. A is actually correct here. So good job for those of you that answered A. I was blown away when I realized that A was the correct answer. This seems incredibly recent to me. 3,000 years ago, we weren't living in caves. Humans were living in cities, and we had agriculture, and we had trade and writing. Our technology, we didn't have smartphones, but it seems very, very recent. It's only about 100 generations back. So we are all 100th cousins of each other, basically, if not closer. And this was estimated by, sort of modeling, making certain assumptions about the generation time. Do people on average reproduce at 25 or at 30? Making assumptions about population size in different parts of the world, and also making assumptions or informed guesses about how likely you are to, produce offspring with somebody, from 5 miles away, from 10 miles away, from 600 miles away. So how much gene flow is there between human populations at different points in human history? So that's how we get to this figure of around 100 generations, remarkably early. And that figure of 100 generations, that is even accounting for the fact that some human populations are very isolated and very remote and almost never interbreed with other populations. Most human populations, there is now a lot more gene flow in. And so for most of us, we are at least 50th cousins, if not closer, to almost every other human on the planet. And for some populations, it's even closer. So the average citizen of the UK has almost 200,000 individuals in the same country that are no more distant than 6th cousins. Okay, but let's get into meeting actually other species that are our evolutionary relatives. You probably know, it's probably not news to you, that our most close living relatives are the chimpanzees and also the bonobos, called the pygmy chimps. So if we go back in time about 6 million years, although you don't need to remember any of these numbers, about 6 million years ago, that is when we shared our most recent common ancestor, not just with chimps, but also with bonobos. So chimps and bonobos are actually more closely related to each other than they are to us. So chimps and bonobos are each other's closest relative. But from our point of view as humans, here's humans, they are both equally closely related to us. So the fact that this little cartoon has chimpanzees on the left and bonobos on the right, closer to us, that doesn't mean anything. They could have drawn it with bonobos on the left and chimps on the right. Bonobos and chimps share a most recent common ancestor 2 million years ago. That is when those two lineages diverged from each other. Farther back in time, 6 million years ago, that is when the most recent common ancestor of this lineage that gave rise to the bonobos and chimps and this lineage that gave rise to us, they would have lived. If we are descended from chimpanzees, why are there still chimpanzees around? What's the problem with this question? Yeah. Very good, excellent. Yeah, we are not descended from chimpanzees. We are related to chimpanzees. We are related to chimpanzees because we are evolutionary cousins of chimpanzees. We have a common ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos. That's not the same as us being descended from chimpanzees. So this most recent common ancestor here, what kind of creature was this? Well, it wasn't exactly a human, but it wasn't really a chimpanzee or a bonobo either. All of the lineages have evolved in the last 6 million years. And so this most recent common ancestor was neither a chimpanzee nor a bonobo nor a human. Okay, so there's a difference between being related to something and being descended from it. We are descended from these individuals at the rendezvous points. We are related to, but not descended from, other individuals at the tips of this tree, other modern species. So now we're going to travel along. We've got humans and chimpanzees and bonobos, and we're all going back in time. And our next most close evolutionary cousins turn out to be the gorillas. And there are 2 species of gorillas alive on the planet today. And our most recent common ancestor with gorillas would have lived around 7 million years ago. So it's a little bit more distantly related to us than chimpanzees are, but not much. So we meet up with the gorillas. And at this point in time, we've got all of the African great apes are traveling together. So at this rendezvous point, 7 million years ago, this thing would have been the most recent common ancestor of all the African great apes. So this term, African great apes, includes us, it includes gorillas, it includes the chimps and the bonobos. So now we've got all of our African great apes traveling together, going farther back in time. And we would next meet up with the orangutans. Our next most close evolutionary cousins after the gorillas are the orangutans. And orangutans are great apes, but they're not African great apes. Their evolutionary history is all in Asia, around Asia. So they are the Asian great apes. Orangutans, this is drawn with like 2, a few years ago, we would have said there are like 2 species of orangutan in the world. We actually know there's 3 different species of orangutan now, so a new orangutan just dropped fairly recently. But this point in time, this rendezvous with orangutans, with these Asian great apes, happened around 14 million years ago. And so at this point now, we've got the most recent common ancestor of all the great apes, including the African great apes like us, and the Asian great apes. We'll keep going. We meet up with about 12 or so species of gibbons farther back, so maybe 18 million years ago, we meet up with gibbons. And at this point now, everything that we have met so far is an ape. Some of them are great apes, some of them are not great apes, but we've got all the apes traveling together. And going back farther in time, still, around 25 million years ago, we would meet up with our most recent common ancestor with the old world monkeys. So there's, I don't know, there's a few dozen species of old world monkey, like this proboscis monkey here. I just like this picture. They diverged from the lineages leading to the apes about 25 million years ago. And then, if we travel with the old world monkeys farther back down the tree, we're going to come to another rendezvous point where we meet up with another several dozen species that also call themselves monkeys, the New World monkeys, like this howler monkey. And our rendezvous point, our joining point with the New World monkeys is about 40 million years ago. And now we've got a problem, because it turns out the term monkey does not accurately reflect evolutionary relationships. Why? It's because, there we go, yeah, this old world monkey is actually more closely related to us, to humans, than it is to New World monkeys. And so it doesn't make sense to just lump all the monkeys together when some so-called monkeys are closer related to things that we don't think are monkeys. So this is sort of a problem. This is a case of our classification, our names for things not reflecting evolutionary relationships. Okay, going back farther, I'm not going to hit all of these rendezvous points, but just some of my favorites. About 58 million years ago, we would arrive at our most recent common ancestor with about 5 species of tarsier. They're super cute. They've got these big eyes because all the tarsiers are nocturnal. They are not active during the day. They're active in the night in low light conditions. And then farther back still, we would meet up with another group of primates, the lemurs and the lorises. And this takes us back to about 63 million years ago. And at this point, we have now, everything that we have met has been what we call a primate. So we have now come to the most recent common ancestor of all the primates, human and non-human primates. 63 million years ago. You know what else was happening around then, just before that? Yeah, 65 million years ago. This is not a rendezvous point. This is just an important event, this massive collision with an asteroid or a meteorite, whatever it was, that sort of massively changed the climate on Earth temporarily and set off a mass extinction event. Okay. We're not going to hit all these rendezvous points as I said, but about, how many years ago is that? I don't know. It's a lot. Farther back still in time, we're going to meet up with the rodents and the rabbits. So they are all traveling together. Rodents and rabbits are quite closely related to each other. The most notable thing about rodents is that they are very, very good at forming new species. There's thousands of species of rodents alive on the planet now. Now, our next most close relatives after the rodents and the rabbits is a real mixed bag of animals, all mammals, called the Laurasiatheres. So you may remember that after the supercontinent Pangaea sort of split up into a northern part and a southern part, everything that we have met up with so far before the Laurasiatheres had its early evolutionary history on the southern part of the continent. The Laurasiatheres had their evolutionary history on the northern part of the continent, on the supercontinent of Laurasia. And they're super diverse. They include things like this hippopotamus, but also the bats, but also shrews, but also cats and dogs, like the carnivores, but also camels. So it's a real mixed bag of different types of mammal. We'll skip through a few of these rendezvous points here just for time. I want to say something about the marsupials. So about 140 million years ago, that would have been the point in time where we shared a most recent common ancestor with the marsupial mammals. Most of the marsupials are endemic now to the continent of Australia. They sort of have a very different gestation system than we do, than placental mammals do. But marsupials provide a lot of awesome examples of convergent evolution. So up here, this picture is a marsupial mole. And you'll see that it has really tiny, reduced eyes, but big claws. It's well adapted for digging and living in an underground environment. And it looks tremendously similar. It has a lot of traits in common with what we, as non-Australians, think of as like a regular mole or a placental mole. And these similarities are not due to close common ancestry. It's been 140 million years since these two things last shared a common ancestor. The marsupial mole is much closer related to like a koala bear or a kangaroo than it is to the little gray guy. These similarities reflect adaptations to similar environments. So they both have the same selective pressures, they both have the same lifestyles. It's a case of convergent evolution. Similarities can reflect common ancestry, but in this case, these similarities seem to reflect convergent evolution. Farther back still in time, about 180 million years ago, we come to the most recent common ancestor of all the mammals. In other words, we meet up with the monotremes, the egg-laying mammals like this platypus and spiny echidnas. So at this point, we've got all the mammals united, traveling down the tree of life together. Okay. So I got salty about the term monkeys, and I'm about to get salty again about the term reptiles, because like monkeys, reptiles is one of those terms that does not actually, it turns out, reflect evolutionary relationships. And so if you look at the evolutionary relationships here, you will see that there are things like alligators and snakes and lizards and chameleons. These things have a more recent common ancestor with birds than they do with other things like turtles that we call reptiles. So reptiles is another example of these terms that do not reflect evolutionary relationships. Why? Because we call a snake, here's a snake, okay. We call a snake a reptile, but here's the most recent common ancestor of snakes and birds. Here is the most recent common ancestor of snakes and turtles. So snakes are actually more closely related to birds than they are to turtles. Why do we lump snakes together with turtles and call them reptiles unless we're also going to include birds as reptiles? Talk more about why this is an easy mistake to make in the next lecture cycle, which is about phylogenetic analysis. Just know that reptiles is another of these terms that doesn't reflect evolutionary relationships. We're going to go farther back in time. About 340 million years ago, we would meet up with the amphibians. So we've got the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, and now they meet up with the amphibians, and this represents the most recent common ancestor of all the tetrapod vertebrates. A tetrapod vertebrate being any vertebrate that isn't a fish. And fish bring the drama again. Fish is another term, it turns out, that doesn't make evolutionary sense. And this is evidenced by the fact that we meet up with the fish not in one single rendezvous point, but actually in like 5 different rendezvous points. So first, we meet up with the lungfish, and then farther back in evolutionary time, we would meet up with the coelacanths, and then farther still back in evolutionary time, would meet up with the ray-finned fish, what we think of as like, true fish. And then farther back in evolutionary time, we would meet up with the sharks, and then really far back in evolutionary time, we meet up with the jawless fish. And what this means is that something like a lungfish or a coelacanth is actually much more closely related to humans or birds or bonobos than it is to other things we call fish, like a shark or a ray-finned fish or a jawless fish. So fish, another term that doesn't reflect evolutionary relationships. Anyway, we finally get to the most recent common ancestor of all the vertebrates, and fish is a bad term. We'll skip through a lot of some more rendezvous points, but I will mention the protostomes. So up until now, everything that we have met and have been traveling with is called a deuterostome. That is just simply a term for a sequence of embryonic development. Animals are either deuterostomes or protostomes. We meet up with the protostomes, which include insects, but also a lot of other invertebrate creatures. And I said the rodents were really speciose, were very rich in species. The protostomes are like incredibly rich in species. So, there's about 1.2 million described species of eukaryotes. Most of those, over 1 million of that 1.2 million are protostomes. And most of those are beetles. So beetles, for whatever reason, are incredibly species rich. More broadly, most of these are insects. And so this famous quote, to a first approximation, all animals are insects. If you randomly select a species of animal, it's probably an insect. Okay, farther back still, skipping over a few of the other rendezvous points. Eventually, we have all the animals traveling together. Okay, the protostomes, the deuterostomes, the invertebrates, the vertebrates, and then once all the animals are traveling together, our next closest relatives are the fungi. They can be unicellular. Fungi can be multicellular. Here's a multicellular fungus, this cool little bird's nest fungus. Once the animals and the fungi are traveling together, our next most close evolutionary cousins after that are a group of organisms called the amoebozoa, the amoebozoans, like this slime mold here is an example. Amoebozoans can also be either unicellular or multicellular. And then after the amoebozoans, our next closest evolutionary relatives are the plants, all the different species of plants out there. And the only thing I want to point out here is that for us, for animals, there are both unicellular species and multicellular species. Similarly, for fungi, there's both unicellular and multicellular forms. For amoebozoa, they could be unicellular or multicellular, and plants also have unicellular species and multicellular species. What this means is that multicellularity and large body size is something that has evolved many different times, at least 4 different times, once in each of these lineages, probably more often than that. So another really important example of convergent evolution. Okay, almost at the end here. I want to give a nod to our very distant cousins, the archaea. These are a type of prokaryotes, but they're not true bacteria. Archaea are sort of famous for being able to inhabit very, very inhospitable or harsh environments. So here's a picture of Yellowstone Pool, or sorry, Emerald Pool at Yellowstone National Park. And Emerald Pool is not the kind of place you would ever want to go swimming. It is like a pool of boiling hot acid. And you would die if you fell into it, and every year people do fall into it, getting photo ops and have a horrible death. But archaea are actually perfectly happy. They are like forming these mats or biofilms on the surface of this boiling hot pool of acid. So they're very, very well adapted to these extreme environments. If it's very cold or very hot or very salty or very high pressure close to the center of the earth, you and I couldn't live there, but an archaea could. And then finally, we are related to everything else, but our most distant evolutionary relatives are the bacteria. So our most recent common ancestor with the bacteria turns out to be good old LUCA. At the very base, this initial speciation point, that's LUCA. So the take-home messages then, I guess, is that, again, everything is related to everything else through common descent. It's always amazing to me that we can get from LUCA to humans in just 39 speciation events. There's just 39 of these rendezvous points, not all of which I went over today, but that's how many there seem to have been. And again, why do species have similarities? It could be due to shared ancestry. Sometimes similarities reflect convergent evolution instead. Okay, I'll see you in a couple days. Thanks.